Oh, good morning, everyone. Good to see you. If you're visiting here this morning, we are wrapping up a series today on the book of Ruth. Ruth is a little 4-chapter book in the beginning of your Bible, probably written by Samuel. And the opening verse says it happened around the time of judges. So there were no kings at the time, economic hardship, pretty much like what we are going through today and seeing in the world today. And so let me give you the main idea in the book and then a very short summary of the script, because we're coming to the very end just for the sake of those who haven't been here for the last 3 or 4 weeks. And so the main idea of this book is redemption. That is a big word, big theological word, which simply means making good a bad situation. So to redeem a situation is not looking cool, but it's going to be redeemed, made good. Who of you are Manchester City supporters? 1 or 2. Very sad and depressed. The rest of them haven't got out of bed this morning. So if you were watching a Manchester City game last night, it was a shocking situation, but it could have been redeemed by good company. Could have been redeemed by the prospect of a great day today. And so every time you adopt a child's trajectory was going that way, but as you adopt that child, you redeem its life. Every time you offer somebody a job, and they were sitting at home, distressed, when you offer them the job, you redeem their future, you redeem their situation. And so the book of Ruth is about a bad situation being redeemed. And it's not just a quaint little story that God has put to tuck in your kids to bed at night. It's not just a little rom-com to alleviate some rather tough messages in the Bible. No, the Old Testament speaks of something coming. That redemption story speaks of a redemption story coming. And so that's where we're going to wind up today, in chapter 4, which points to the redemption that we have in Jesus. This is the plot. There was a guy called Elimelech. He was married and lived in Bethlehem. A famine came on the land, so he gathered up his wife and his 2 boys, and they went to a place called Moab, which was not a pretty place to go. He must have been desperate. Desperate people emigrate, often. You've heard it in the news the last couple of weeks. Immigrants having a real problem, thinking it's greener on the other side. But it hasn't been for many of them. And so it wasn't for them. They actually lost the dad, Elimelech, he died. The 2 boys died. And so the opening chapter sees a widow who calls herself Mara, who says, I'm bitter. She says, don't call me Naomi. That was her real name, which meant sweetness. Don't call me sweetness. I'm actually bitter because I've lost my husband. And I've lost my 2 boys. And so she turns to her in-laws and she says to the 2 girls, you should stay here with your folks. I'm going back to Bethlehem. The one kisses her goodbye and says, thanks, Mom, cheers, bye. The other one says, where you go, I go. Your people, my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I die. You can't get rid of me that easy. So she arrives back home. And the townsfolk say, could this be Naomi? It's been so long since we've seen her. And look who she's got with her, a Moabite. Now, the Moabites were not highly regarded. In fact, if a Moabite married into your family, your descendants could not go into the temple for 10 generations. That's how much the Israelites despised them. Anyway, these 2 widows talk to each other, and the younger one says, listen, I'm still able-bodied. I can go and glean. I can go and collect up the scraps after the guys have been reaping the fields. We can bring that grain home. We can at least have some bread to eat. So Mom says, off you go. She goes, cut a long story short, she winds up in the field of a distant relative. Now, there was a law in that land that said this is how poor widows could have their situation redeemed, their bad situation sorted out, made good. A distant relative could marry the widow, include her in his household, raise children with her, and And those children wouldn't have to take his name, they would take the deceased man's name, and so that family would be perpetuated in Israel. So she winds up in the field of a distant relative. So technically speaking, he could have married the old girl, but she was really old and wasn't up for marriage. And so technically speaking, he could marry a Moabitess. But who would want to do that when your kids weren't allowed into the temple for the next 10 years? Who would want to bring a foreigner like that into your family? So the odds were not good that this distant relative who owned this land was going to make a move to rescue them. But the plot unfolds, and he turns out to be a really kind guy. His name is Boaz. Really kind. And he sees this young girl in the field and says to his guys who are operating in the labor, "Who is she?" Some of you cynics would have said he just saw a pretty girl and asked her of her name. But actually he was like scanning his field, looking at the field. He'd come to see how it was going. He says, "I don't recognize her." They said, "Actually, that's a distant relative of yours. She's the widow of your cousin's cousin's cousin," sort of thing. And so he calls her over and says, "Listen, you mustn't glean on the edge of the field. It's dangerous, man. People get raped here. People get hurt here. Come and hang out with my laborers." And then he says to the laborers quietly, "Pull a whole lot of stuff out of your stacks so that she's got stuff to pick up." She goes home that night with a basket full of what she's gleaned, and her mother-in-law says to her, "Where have you been? How can you bring so much home?" She must have been dragging the stuff through the door. She says, "I've been in Boaz's field." She says, "Boaz? Gee, my girl, he's a relative. He could rescue us. He could redeem us." So she goes to the end of the harvest, the barley harvest. So I'm assuming it's a couple of months. And Naomi, this is the old girl, hatches a plan, calls the young girl in and says, "Listen, you're pretty, you're still young. If we've got any chance, he's not going to marry an old girl like me. Maybe you should go and just put it to him that he marries you." So she gets dolled up, and the Bible says she put perfume on so she wasn't smelling like the laborers, and did her hair. And from that day onwards, I suppose ladies have taken it as a biblical thing to spend an hour in front of the mirror before you go anywhere. But she gets herself all sorted out, and she arrives. And the old girl says, "Don't let anyone see you there." So she's hanging out in the shadows. She says, the old dude Boaz, at the end of the barley harvest party, he's going to fall asleep right next to on his grain. That's where he's going to fall asleep. And she says, what you need to do, when everybody's sleeping, sneak up to him, lift the blanket near his feet, and just lie down there. That's a signal that you are open to be married to him. So it says this in the ESV. "And at midnight, behold, Boaz woke up." She probably tickled his feet or something. Probably thought, this isn't going the way I planned it. And behold, there's a woman at his feet. He says, "Who are you?" She says, "I'm Ruth, your cousin's widow." Technically, she says, "Put your garment over me," which is a way of saying in those days, "Please marry me." Oh, ladies. She's quite, didn't have to wait until he pops a question. Tonight, incidentally, we're going to hear a very charming story of an engagement that went seriously wrong. An engagement proposal. And off the back of it tonight, what we're going to be looking at is ideas of, God's ideas of romance wrapped up in this story. Anyway, that's not our main point today. So she says to him, "You could marry me. I know I'm a Moabite. I know it's dark and you can't really see what you're looking at. But I'm the widow of your next of kin." He says, You shouldn't be here. She said, I know you've got a good reputation, but don't let people see you here. He loads her up with a whole lot more grain, says you can't go back to your mother without a whole lot of stuff. And before anybody sees you, sneak out. So she sneaks off back again and says to her mom, I think we've hit the jackpot. And the old girl says, you're right. If it went like you told me it went, his last verse in chapter 3, he will not rest until he settles this matter. Because he had said to Ruth, actually, I can marry you, but technically speaking, there's a relative closer to your ex-husband, and he has first rights. So that's where we pick up the story this morning. Are you with me? So those who have missed the narrative of the last 3 or 4 weeks, we all should be on the same page. So chapter 4, verse 1 starts like this. So let's try and put ourselves in Boaz's shoes. He's an old guy. In fact, this is what he said to her in chapter 3. He said, I can't believe you've looked at me to do this. I'm an old codger. You could have gone and run after a youngster. And so he takes it as quite a bit of flattery. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken, in other words, the other relative, came by. So Boaz said, turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside, and he sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So they all sat down. Boaz is a man with a mission. And the first thing we see here is that opportunities to redeem come across our path all the time. And so Boaz sees this opportunity, and he's going to act on it. I don't know if you've ever thought, when you're standing in a bank queue and some really grumpy person is in front of you, is that just chance? Or is there an opportunity to redeem? To make a bad day a good one for that guy? When our kids were small and we came out of car parks, and you know the tradition in this country is to pay people, tip them, who stand next to your car as car guards. And I can remember when my kids were really, really small, there was this, I want to give them money, I want to give them money, I want to give them, and the whole thing was, they want to lean out the window and give the money. And after it happened a couple of times, I felt that this was a teaching opportunity for my kids. And so I said to them, every time they're in the car, you look at that person in the eye, and you call them sir or ma'am, and you thank them for doing a good job for looking after your car. And then you give them the money. Now, you say, God, that's such a little thing. Yes, but for someone who's standing in the sun all day, for a child to be polite, to look them in the eye, and to give them dignity, and say, actually, you're doing a job here. You're not begging here. You're turning someone's situation. You're saying to them, I honor you. That's a small act of redemption. They come up across our path all day. Sometimes smiling at someone is a small act of redemption. And he took these 10 men in the city and they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, so they're talking about a common relative, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders and of my people. If you redeem it, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and then I come after you. And so he said, I will redeem it. So he's basically saying to his cousin, listen, the old girl needs help. Buy her land so she's got some money to live on for the rest of her life. He says, okay, of course I'll do it. Then Boaz comes in for the kill. Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite. He didn't say Ruth the pretty young girl. He said Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead. in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in the inheritance. So now he's saying, when you buy that land and you help the old girl, you get a Moabite in your house. She's going to produce kids that are not of your name. They're going to have title to your land. Redemption comes at a cost. Cost Boaz. And this is the cost that this guy was looking at. And of course, you know what he's going to say. Hey, the Redeemer says, I cannot redeem it, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself. I cannot redeem it. Now, we can't judge this guy too harshly. He's protecting his family. He's making a common sense decision. But what we can see from it is that he's turned up an opportunity to redeem. We passed it by. Opportunities for redemption come by every day, and this is also what happens. We just pass them by every day. And some of it is not sinful. It's just you missing an opportunity. So when, verse 8, the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal, and it's explained previously that was the custom. And so Boaz, he takes off his sandal and he has the interaction takes place. Boaz doesn't miss the opportunity to redeem. In fact, Naomi had said, you watch, Boaz, good guy. He's gonna deal with this tonight, before the night settles. He's not going to faff around and miss the opportunity. You know, sometimes God opens a window of opportunity for you to do something, and it's not there tomorrow. It's not there tomorrow. It's not, I'm going to do it some other day. I'll become a nice guy. Actually, it's got a lifespan. Jesus didn't pass by opportunities to redeem. There's an old lady giving a coin, and people are sort of mocking the little coin that pops into the basket. He stands up, he draws attention to her, he redeems the situation. There's a woman pushing through, and she's desperate. She grabs hold of his garment, and he pauses. He pauses, and he talks to her, and he brings dignity to her. He brings dignity to Martha in her kitchen. He didn't miss opportunities to redeem. And what we also see through this process of redeeming, making good a bad situation, is that it's not just a one-off thing that you do once, and you're not just waiting for the big moment. I'm going to be a Boaz, but I'm waiting for my Ruth to come along. It's like it's a lifestyle. If you represent Jesus, it's a lifestyle of redeeming. And one act of redemption opens a door to another. The first thing Boaz did was smile, was noticed her, was offered her protection, was offered her some food. And then he went off with the rest of his harvest. And those acts of kindness, those acts of redemption, led and paved the way for his wife. Who was here last Sunday night? Just wave at me. Okay. Then I can retell that story. Last week, I went to a company in Howick, a massive company, a massive rubber company, Dunlop. And the reason I went there was because we had written them an email about 6 months ago saying, can we talk to you about plonking a container on the side of your land, because we have a site there right next to Dunlop, and between Dunlop, Howick Falls, Waterfalls, and the golf club, there are 6,000 people that are squatting. They're mainly from Lesotho. There's no water, there's no sewerage, there's no electricity. But there's a church there. Meets under a tree. 2 of our pastors go there every week. Right now, while I'm talking to you, they're standing under a tree. And there's about 100 people gathered around them. There's even up-down happening under another tree. For a year, they've done that. Wind, rain, hot, cold. Wintertime, they moved out from under the tree so they weren't in the shade. Anyway, one day, a guy who I think was just like a street sweeper in the factory came to the pastors and said, listen, if you want to talk to someone at Dunlop, because we couldn't get in there, here's the email address of the boss. That's why I sent the email. We didn't hear from the guy until last week. And last week, I get a message that he would like to see me. So I pick up these two pastors and we go in through the main gate. It's a fancy gate that you even make me do a breathalyzer test. I said, hey, I'm a pastor. What do you want me to do a breathalyzer test for? Everybody has to do the breathalyzer test. I said, what do you think? I took communion this morning, or what's the story? I got in, I'm sitting around a boardroom table, and there's two big Afrikaans guys there and another lady. And I'm assuming they're from Howick, but I figure out pretty soon that they don't even know the name of Shias. They don't know that they're Lesotho people. And I understood that they came from Pretoria. So I was having a meeting now, not with Howick's bosses, but Dunlop South Africa bosses. So I said, what do you want? So I said, well, let me tell you who I am before I say what I want. Yeah, this is my story. This is these guys' story. And Freedom told his testimony, how he was a street kid and that God had saved him at one of our meetings. And now he was married to a graduate and he was a pastor. I saw the lady there who was one of their finance ladies who was quite touched by that. And eventually we'd finished the story. He said, okay, but what is it that you guys were after? So I said, well, it could be one of three scenarios. The first scenario is not very attractive, but it would really help us if you allowed us to plonk a container on your land so you can put chairs and stuff, because they're sitting on paint tins, etc. Nice put a tent in there too so we can pop it up in the morning. He says, yeah, okay, maybe we can talk about that. What else? What would another scenario be? Well, I said, well, that you let me peg out a piece of land and you let me build a building on your land. And we'll meet in there 24/7. We'll bring community projects in here, the whole lot. So he laughs a bit and he says, okay, and what would the best scenario be? Well, I said, well, that's easy. You build me the building on your piece of land. So he responded just like you did. And then he said, let's go out and see the land. So we walk out to see the land. As we're walking out there, he says, you know what? You remind me of my pastor and my church. I said, oh, I'm thinking he's a good Afrikaans Dutch Reform boy. But he used the word pastor. So I said, oh, where are you from? So he says, Pretoria. I said, no, what part of Pretoria? So he says, Pretoria East. Now, I know someone in Pretoria East who is English. One of the very few that is up there. And so I said, is this his name? He said, I can't believe you know him. I said, yeah, he's a very good friend of mine. He said, well, look, let me tell you what that guy did to me two months ago. He says, I started attending his church because his wife says there's a church in a tent. We should go to that tent. It's better than where we're going. So I went along and it's actually quite nice. But a couple of months ago, I was sitting in a restaurant with my wife. And this guy walks in with his wife. Big restaurant. And I know them. They don't know me. And they have a meal together. But I felt quite uncomfortable because the whole way through the meal, he was watching me. He was looking at me. Anyway, when he was finished, he walks up to my table with a handful of money. And he puts the money on the table and he says, God says, you must have this. He says, sir, I don't need your money. He says, I know you don't. But God says you must have this. Okay, bye, I'm going. And he walked out the door. He said, go on. I sat there and this was like hot money in front of me. It was like hot money. I didn't know what to do with it. I thought, what do I do? So he took it out. He said, can I give it to someone, like a car guard or somebody? He said, I couldn't find anyone to give. So I said to my wife, Frankie, tomorrow we are going to that church and I'm going to go and ask that guy why he gave me that money. So anyway, my friend was quite amazed that this dude actually was part of his church. And he says to him, why did you give me the money? So my friend looks at him and he says to him, because Jesus wants you to know how to receive from him. This money didn't come from me, it came from him. He wants you to know how to receive from him. And he says, Grant, it was like I was punched in the stomach. He says, I became alive that day as I received from Jesus. And then he remembered our email. And by the time this conversation had come to an end, the other financial lady says, when the building goes up, I'm coming to paint it. Now, if you look at this story, what we're saying is, One act of redemption, one act of kindness opens the door. I wouldn't even have been standing there had that sweeper not given the email address. I certainly wouldn't have been standing there if my friend had been sitting at the table. He had looked at that guy, and said, Lord, give a rich guy money. Are you sure? What about all the other homeless people I could be giving that money to? And God says, no, actually, that guy's heart needs to be opened with your wallet. So that simple act from that pastor opens this CEO's heart wide. And I'm telling you, thousands of people are going to hear the gospel because of that one act. Thousands. One act of redemption leads to multiple. It's not a one-off thing that you do. It's the way we live. Let me start drawing this to a close. So the people, verse 11, who were at the gate, and the elders or witnesses, and then this is what they say. May the woman that is coming into your house be like Rachel and Leah. That's Jacob's wives, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephratah, and may you be renowned in Bethlehem. May you be well known. When you act like Boaz, who was a forerunner of Jesus, to make good bad situations, to bring life where there's death, to bring hope where there's sadness. When you dare, Aubrey got up and he says he feels God is saying that some of you, direction, purpose, what God's got for you is going to come alive today. Listen, that guy who sweeps the store at Dunlop acted in his sphere of influence. And as he did, life's come. As you redeem like Boaz, God gets glorified, lives get changed. Listen, this woman was about to go from scavenger to landlord. She was about to go from alien to citizen. She was about to go from someone who was hanging with the employees to boss. She was going to move from displaced to queen of the home. One act brings glory to God, changes lives. But then they say a very curious thing to her. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Tamar bore to Judah. Tamar was a woman. Judah was her father-in-law. Let me tell you the story because it's a very weird blessing to pray over somebody. Jacob had some sons. He had some good sons. Joseph was the blue-eyed boy. Benjamin, likewise. If you were going to pick the blue-eyed boy out of Joseph's sons, you would not pick Judah. He was a rough diamond. Anyway, Judah had 3 sons. At least 3 that we know of. His oldest was named Imagine, what's your son's name, sir? I think he was drunk. I think that, he burped and that was the boy's name. Anyway, the Bible describes him as violent, and he marries a woman called Tamar. He's violent and he's abusive. And dies. He has a brother who's worse than him called Onan, who abuses sexually this girl. And he dies. There's a lot Lamaki called Sheila. This guy had a great way of naming his sons. Sheila. So Judah says to his daughter-in-law, listen, my 2 oldest boys are dead. Go back to your mom and dad. And when Sheila's grown up, I'll give you to him as his wife. Anyway, when Sheila grew up, he said, "Oh, Dad, man, I don't want the old girl. I want a new wife." So Sheila marries someone else. She's sitting at home. She's been abused. She's a widow. She's living with mom and dad. She is in a seriously bad state. And she hatches a devious plan. Because father-in-law, he's lost his wife. And so she says, "I know that guy. He's not a moral man." So she dresses up as a prostitute. Stands on the side of the road, just her eyes sticking out of her garb, like the temple prostitutes used to dress. And she solicits him. And so there's a prostitution deal that goes on. He hasn't got the cash or the goat to pay. So she says, "Don't worry, just give me your belt and your staff as security. Send the goat later." You say, "Grant, that's a horrific story." Yes, it's in your Bible. Anyway, that act of prostitution results in her having twins. And as the twins are about to be born, the first one's on his way out, and the midwife ties a cord, which is what they would do when twins came out, so that they could remember who the firstborn was. In those days, being firstborn had a privilege. But there was another one in the womb called Perez. Apparently, he pulled the other dude back inside, and he jumped out next without the cord in his hand. And so they called him Perez, which means breached. He breached out in front. He stole the thunder. He came out. He said, "Okay, brother, you can stay behind. I'm the firstborn." That's Perez. Born out of prostitution. Father-in-law with a devious mother. And they say, "May your kids be like Perez." Oh. You see, Ruth had come in from the outside. She was seen as unclean. And yet somehow, as God had redeemed the Perez story, they're saying God's redeeming this story. Do you know that both those ladies' children form part of the family line of Jesus? Together with Rahab the spy. Sorry, the prostitute who was in Jericho. She was Boaz's mother. So you've got Rahab. You've got Perez. You've got Ruth in the line of Jesus. Do you think that's an accident? This is what God's saying. He can use anybody to redeem. He will redeem you to redeem. He will change your world, and He doesn't expect you to say thank you, sit on the sideline, and wait until you go to heaven. No, He's going to use you as an instrument of redemption. And then, I wonder if the band could come forward as we look at this very final and most amazing verse. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may His name be renowned in Israel." So the women folk, because Naomi is holding her grandchild, say to Naomi, "God bless you, because He's given you a redeemer." In other words, Mara, bitter old girl, has become sweet again. Her desperate situation has changed. Blessed be to God, because He's given you a redeemer. But this is the fascinating thing. Who is she talking about? "He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." They're saying to Naomi, it's not Boaz who is your redeemer. It's not your daughter-in-law Ruth who is your redeemer. You are holding your redeemer. Perez. Perez was a cradle and an ancestor of Boaz, which became an ancestor of the son that Naomi was holding, who formed part of the cradle of the great Redeemer coming, which is Jesus. When they said to her, "You're holding your Redeemer," they were speaking prophetically about her descendant, Jesus the Redeemer. See, these Old Testament stories point to a great Redeemer. The theologian Spurgeon puts it this way. He says, Jesus is our glorious Boaz. Jesus, our glorious Boaz. Just like Boaz redeemed Ruth, Jesus, our glorious Boaz. This is the way he puts it. He says, you wound up in his field. All of us have. And he saw you in his field. He looked at you. He talked kindly to you. He drew you to himself. And then he offered you kindnesses until it got to the point where you were willing to surrender your independence. And when you surrendered your independence, he said, would you be my bride? Would you be translated from alien into citizen? From unclean into clean? From tenant to owner? He's our glorious Boaz. Why don't we stand together, please? I'm going to hand this meeting back to these pastors in the front in a moment. I've got to nip up the hill to preach up there. But I believe God has been speaking to two groups of people today. To some, as Aubrey got up and said, you're wrestling with my meaning in life, my call, my purpose. I believe God's word to you is this: you have been redeemed to redeem. Don't wait for this amazing lightning strike and Ruth to appear. You've been redeemed to redeem. And the smallest acts of redemption all add up to God being glorified, lives changing. But he wants to breathe hope into many of you, saying, actually, you say, God, I'm an ugly person. Actually, Boaz, how do you get to become an old bullet like that and not get married? Maybe there were some quirks in Boaz. Maybe he was just a beautiful man up until that point. I don't know. But I can tell you that Perez's mom, that Rahab, they were like you and me. And then there's another group of people here today. I believe your glorious Boaz, Jesus, has been after you. You've been hanging around in his field. It's like he's given you the liberty to be there, but you're not yet part of his family. And his invitation there is to you now. We're going to sing this song, and you can have an opportunity to surrender. To surrender your independence. Say, God, here I am. Make me yours.